And so by raising Lazarus from the dead, Jesus sealed his own fate. The stage was set for Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. The stage was set for the greatest drama in history to be played out, where man would do his worst and God would give his best. Now, when Jesus arrives at Lazarus' home, we read in verse 35, it says that Jesus wept. That's the shortest verse in the Bible, by the way. And for you kids, if your parents are making you memorize verses and you can choose them, John 11:35 is a good one. 2 words. Jesus wept. You got it memorized. Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the Bible. And the Bible doesn't tell us exactly why Jesus wept. He arrived. Lazarus, he found out his friend. Lazarus has been dead 4 days. And as Jesus gets to the tomb, verse 35 says that he wept. Many Bible scholars give their opinion as to why they think Jesus wept. And it's very interesting for all of them, because they say they all realize that Jesus knew in just a couple of minutes he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. So why was he crying? Why was he crying because Lazarus was dead? Because he wasn't going to be dead in just a little bit, and Jesus knew that. So what were Jesus' tears for? Some scholars have suggested that Jesus cried because he was moved by the grief of his good friends Mary and Martha. He saw them grieving, and he was moved to grieve as well. Other scholars have thought that Jesus wept because he was angry at sin and the pain and destruction that sin causes. I want to say again, we don't know exactly why Jesus wept, but I like to think that Jesus wept here just before he raised Lazarus from the dead, because he knew that he was calling Lazarus from heaven back to earth, back to a broken, wicked earth. Jesus had been in heaven and had come to earth, and he knew what that was like. And he was calling Lazarus from that place of glory back to this world. And he wept to have to bring his friend back. Well, early in this story, when Jesus first gets the word, backing up, when Jesus first gets the word that his friend Lazarus is sick, Jesus is quite a distance from where Lazarus lay dying. He's actually a whole day's journey away. And by the time Jesus arrives at Lazarus' home, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Now, it's interesting that when Jesus first gets the word that Lazarus is sick unto death, Jesus, even though he was a full day's journey away, he could have just spoken a word, and Lazarus would have been healed. He didn't have to go to Lazarus to heal him. Jesus had done that healing from a distance before. Do you remember the centurion's servant? The centurion asked Jesus to heal his servant, and then the centurion said, "I'm not worthy to have you come to my house. Just say a word from where you are, and my servant will be healed." And Jesus healed the centurion's servant. So Jesus could heal from a distance, but he didn't. He went to where Lazarus was. And I think it's interesting that now, as he's standing in front of that tomb, Jesus is about to utter a mightier word across a greater distance. Instead of calling Lazarus to be healed from miles away, he calls Lazarus from the distance between death and life. And he calls Lazarus back from the dead. He uses the voice that at the end of the age will call all of us out of the grave. We hear it here in this passage ahead of time. And as Jesus stands in front of that tomb in verse 43, he calls out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The power of that command, if you think about it, the power of that command is awesome. Those 3 words, Lazarus, come out, had the same power and effectiveness as when Jesus spoke in Genesis chapter 1, and he said, "Let there be light," as he calls Lazarus from the dead. And I love the Bible's wording of Lazarus rising from the dead as it's recorded in verse 44. In verse 43, Jesus commands Lazarus come out. In the very next verse, here's how it describes Lazarus coming out. It says, "The dead man came out." The dead man came out. This victory over death and the grave, it's so powerful, it's so exciting, it's so awesome that I always miss the next verse, verse 45. And that's the application verse for you and me. This is where the resurrection power comes home for you and me. For verse 45, it says, in response to the dead man coming out, it says, "Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary as she was grieving, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did, put their faith in Jesus." Lazarus' transformation from death to life is the proof that many Jews needed in order to put their faith in Jesus. Jesus had said he was the resurrection and the life, but talk is cheap. Here was proof. There was Lazarus standing over there in the entrance of the tomb, breathing after 4 days of being dead. And Jesus' words were proven true by Lazarus' life. And verse 45 says, many of the Jews who had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. By coming out of the grave, by being transformed by Jesus' power, Lazarus becomes a living witness to the power and the truth of Jesus. He becomes a living witness. And in the very next chapter, in John chapter 12, we're told that Mary and Martha, the sisters, are so happy they throw a big party in Jesus' honor. And verse 9 tells us that a large crowd of Jews came to that party when they found out that Jesus was going to be there, because they wanted to see the one who had power over death. But verse 9 says that the large crowd came not just to see Jesus, but they came to see Lazarus as well. They came to see that living witness. They came to see the proof that Jesus is the giver of life, that the proof that Jesus is the victor over death. Lazarus' transformation from death to life was so powerful that verse 11 says that, for on account of Lazarus, many Jews were going over to Jesus and putting their faith in him. That's the second time we've heard that. In chapter 11, verse 45, we're told that because Lazarus was raised, people were putting their faith in Jesus. And then in chapter 12, verse 11, we're told the same thing. Lazarus was a living witness. He was a walking testimony, and people were being converted to Christ because of his life.